Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. We are fast approaching the International Booker Prize for 2023. The long list announcement coming sort of a little bit later in March. And as a result, I suppose tongues are wagging about sort of what that might potentially look like. And so I thought basically I might have a go at trying to predict what might be on that long list. All of this is worth adding with a massive pinch of salt that I have an historically bad track record at predicting the Booker Prize in general, not the international one, but we need a better phrasing for this, because like there's the Booker Prize and the International Booker. So if you're talking about the International Booker and then the other Booker, the regular Booker, I don't know, the non-translated Booker, who knows? Anyway, my track record on that is not great. And that's the prize that I probably would feel the most confident predicting anything of. So I am fairly sure I am going to be way off the mark with this, especially as I'm not particularly clued in always about what international books have been released. However, there is a wonderful list on Goodreads, which I will link below, of books that are eligible, which helps quite a lot. Because it allows me to have a vaguely useful prediction of what might be there. And then it's also worth noting at the beginning, just the eligibility of certain books is also a whole thing within itself, not only because it will be very specific dates of when books will be eligible for, but also that is almost always around the book having been the UK release date of that book. So sometimes it might have been out in English in another location for a while, and wouldn't be eligible in the UK, or hasn't. It's a whole thing. But what I will also note is that there are some other complications or interesting parts of this that I'll kind of go into a little bit as well, that have sort of factored into my decision making. Two big parts stand out for that, which is firstly, publishers have a limit to the amount of books that they're able to submit, and that number is a little bit different depending on publishers and depending on their past history. At least with the other Booker Prize, what this often looks like is each publisher is allowed to send one book, but they get an extra bonus book, with a maximum of, I think, 5 for any book they've had that has been shortlisted in the previous 5 years. And so what that does mean is that sometimes you get a big publisher who has had historically loads and loads of books being eligible, and so they're still able to submit 4 or 5 each year. Sometimes you get a small press that breaks through once, and that suddenly means that for the next few years they're able to submit a couple of others, all of those kinds of bits. So there are many other complicating factors within this, and so it may well be that even the books that I think may be on there weren't actually submitted by the publisher, either because the publisher didn't have space in their allocation, or because they just decided to go for other books, basically. And so I've kind of separated this out into various different forms of going through it, almost by most likely to least, potentially. So starting off with former winners of the International Booker Prize, whose books are allowed to be submitted immediately. That doesn't kind of cost the publisher one of their book places. Then looking at books that have been by authors who have been shortlisted or longlisted before, and then going through publishers who would have a fair few submissions, and then just some others that are knocking around that I think might have a decent shout. So with all of that lengthy preamble out of the way, let's get started. And so let's start with former winners. And so because these don't count towards publishers' amounts, it's basically safe to assume that they've all just been submitted anyhow. And so 3 former winners are eligible this year. So we have Joka Alkati, who released a bitter orange tree rather. We have Laszlo Krasznahorkai, who has a mountain to the north, a lake to the south, paths to the west, and a river to the east. Great, nice long title going on there. And we also have Han Kang with Greek lessons. So all 3 of these books I think are immediately eligible and will have been submitted. I have read The Bitter Orange Tree. That's the only one of the 3 I've read so far, which I did enjoy. I didn't find it particularly strong in some places. I think it was a very nice and important story, I just wasn't particularly gripped by it. But I think it is a sort of family drama and sort of family tale with sort of echoes of sort of history that do tend to do fairly well at the Booker and international Booker stage. But who knows? Han Kang, I think I've heard pretty interesting things so far from her new book, and I have to admit I know next to nothing about Laszlo Krasznahorkai's book, but I am very keen to read it, and it's also a very short one, so part of me also hopes it makes the list. I'll be saying my choices for who I think will make the final list at the end, but I think from these three I would probably say that Han Kang is probably the more likely. I just think the book sounds a little bit more interesting. I think it's maybe got a bit more of a shout at being there, but let's see. Next up, looking at former books by authors who have previously been shortlisted or longlisted in a couple of occasions as well. And some of these, it's difficult to really see sometimes what that might actually look like, because obviously an author's work can vary between times. It's worth noting that there are different judges each time, so it might not even be just a case of an author, one of the judges really being a fan of a certain person's work and that happening year on year. In fact, it's probably, you know, you'll get kind of quite different tastes and changes, but it probably means that publishers are a little bit more likely to submit them, potentially knowing that there's a little bit more of a chance they might get up there, or to kind of continue a bit of momentum behind authors. Obviously, some publishers will just decide to go for new authors instead, but let's have a quick look. So the one that I think is probably most likely from former shortlisted authors is Mariana Enriquez's Our Share of Night. So she was shortlisted a couple of years ago for her collection of stories, The Dangers of Smoking in Bed, which I didn't really get on with, but I actually really enjoyed Our Share of Night a lot more. I think I always really liked her writing in The Dangers of Smoking in Bed, but just really struggled with the form of a short story and kind of wanted a bit more. And in Our Share of Night, she gave us a lot more because it's 700 pages. I found it a really engaging, if kind of horrific and twisted book that deals a lot with politics and with sort of darknesses of human spirit and all these other things, all with this very twisted, dark sort of story that is really quite unsettling, but I think in a really profound way. It feels like it's not just gratuitous, so I think this one probably has a decent shout of being there. Miko Kawakami, shortlisted last year, has a book out that's eligible this year called All the Lovers in the Night, which I have read, and I enjoyed it overall. I think, again, I didn't kind of feel this same like burning like feeling towards it that that I don't know. I'm not sure if I fully get her as an author yet, and I've only read this and Heaven, so I may well be missing a lot of other stuff. But Kawakami's been a fairly regular presence on book prizes, and I think it's probably, I think it could make it in. It wouldn't be on my personal list, but I think it's a book that could well be there, and would deserve a place there as well. Another shortlisted author from last year, we have Jon Fosse, this time with Melancholy 1 and 2. And I think technically Alice at the Fire is also eligible, but I would assume of the two that Melancholy would be the one shortlisted. Another book is part of a series from Jon Fosse, also published by Fitzcarraldo Press. And I really enjoyed the septology books that I've read all three and really enjoyed what was going on there. So I'm really keen to get around to reading a bit more Fosse. And yeah, I think it should be a really interesting book to read. I think equally, we've got Samantha Schweblin who's eligible again this year, this time with her set of short stories called 7 Empty Houses, which I really enjoyed, actually. I thought there was a lot of absurdity and slight kind of sort of tragedy hidden under the surface in this book in a really interesting way. 7 short stories that really go to some quite dark and interesting places. She again has been a presence on lists, including the International Booker before, and an author that I think very deservedly would be here, I think, would make sense in this list. So really keen to see what happens there. And we have then 3 more that I can see. I may well be missing some long-listed authors from previous years. But we have Orhan Pamuk, who's been shortlisted before, this time with Nights of Plague. This seems like a fairly, I don't know, it seems to have had a bit more of a mixed reaction than I was expecting. He's a Turkish author who's well respected and loved, and has had these really big books that have made sort of splashes in many other ways. Nights of Plague continues that theme by being incredibly long, but I don't know necessarily what to expect from it as a book itself. I know that some people have really loved it and have really enjoyed it. It's around 600 pages, and I will eventually get around to it. It's one of those things where I think if it is long-listed, I'll then probably read it. Otherwise, I might wait a little bit because I'm drowning in books at the moment, which is in some ways a nice problem to have, but also, yeah, it's a thing. We also have a couple of other authors who have been shortlisted or longlisted before. We have Eric Vuillard, who was he a couple of years ago was shortlisted with a book that was absolutely tiny. It was a really short book, and The War of the Poor, and it was, I think, around 80 pages, if that. My audiobook that I had of it was an hour long, and it was one of those ones where I think a lot of people were quite confused about it having made the long list, as I didn't really see that many people reading it and being full of love for it. And then it got shortlisted and everyone was like, sorry, what? But I actually do think this other, his most recent book does sound really interesting, actually. An Honourable Exit, which looks a lot at the lesser-known conflict preceding the Vietnam War. So this is to do with French colonialism and the war. And I think it could be quite interesting. I'm kind of keen to see how this one plays out. We also have Kan Shui, a Chinese author who was longlisted a couple of years ago for a collection of short stories, and this year would be eligible. I've just clicked off the page. With her book, The Barefoot Doctor. So could be another person to trouble the list and kind of appear on there. I have no doubt missed some previously shortlisted or longlisted authors there. Those are the ones that I sort of recognised on site and kind of went through. I sort of tried going through as much as I could to kind of break those down. I have no doubt missed somebody because we're talking a good few years of the International Booker. But anyhow, now to move on to publishers. And this is where I think there's also something quite interesting, because what we saw last year was that the long list of 13 was dominated really by 2 publishers who made up about half the list. So 3 of the long list last year were from Fitzcarraldo Press. 3 of the long list last year were from Tilted Axis. Fitzcarraldo's been around a teeny bit longer, but both are, or maybe it hasn't actually. Fitzcarraldo is probably always younger than I think it is. But anyway, both of them regularly publish lots of translated books and regularly search for really high quality books as well. The winner last year ended up being a Tilted Axis Press book, but 2 of the shortlist were also Fitzcarraldo. So what this means is that both of those presses, by dint of that, have a little bit of extra wiggle room for how many they can submit. They've got some space, they can probably get a couple more in there. And so with that said, I think that they will still have a couple each that they are going to submit that will have a good shout of being there. I've already mentioned Jon Fosse from Fitzcarraldo, but I think we may see a couple of others from Fitzcarraldo. And so I think Fitzcarraldo will have likely submitted some of these, and they, I think, also have a decent shot of being there. I think first up, a book I'm intending to read very, very soon anyway, Stillborn by Guadalupe Natel, is one of the books that I think has a really strong shot of being there. It sounds like a really interesting, gutsy book that I think will be quite sort of fascinating in its own right. I think something by Alejandro Zambra might make it, so either Bonsai or The Private Life of Trees, both of which are eligible. Bonsai came out sort of late last year, I believe, and Private Lives of Trees has just come out. So both within the eligibility window, and could potentially also be part of it. I think there are two others potentially. I mean, there are lots of others that are eligible, but I think of these are the ones I think have a more interesting, not even interesting, more potentially more of an option of getting in there. One is Owlish by Dorothy Tsay, and the other is The Birthday Party by Laurent Mauvignier, rather. And so I think both of these could have a really interesting shout at being part of the list, but who knows? This is the International Booker. Things often go many different ways, and it could be entirely one of the other books that they've submitted that ends up being there. I just think these two books maybe feel like what the International Booker tends to go for. So either this sort of The Birthday Party being this quite reflective and interesting longer book, or something like Owlish that is a little bit more, from what I've heard, I've not read it yet, sounds a little bit more of this kind of slightly, not even experimental, just really sort of vibrant, kind of speculative book. So both of them could be quite interesting. Also features a character called Alice, like Alice at the Fire by Jon Fosse. So we could have a double Alice thing going on in this prize. Who knows? That could be a fun little thing as well. But that's who I think could potentially be there from Fitzcarraldo. Next, we come to another press that I mentioned earlier that have had a good track record in, well, last year especially, and that is Tilted Axis Press. So we know that they'll be able to submit a few. I think a fairly safe bet is potentially Chinatown by Tuan. This is a sort of family drama. It's kind of a bit slightly experimental. I mean, it is basically written in this sort of stream of consciousness, almost one sentence kind of style thing. It's, well, one paragraph kind of thing, and was also longlisted for the Republic of Consciousness. So it's kind of having some love. It's a book I really, really want to read. I will eventually get around to it. I'm planning on reading it very soon because of, well, partly because of the Republic of Consciousness, which has bumped it up. But I also think that there's a potential that So Distant From My Life by Monique Ilboudou might also have a chance of being there, because I think that this is also kind of, it also appeals to some interesting parts of what often the International Booker jury tends to seem to go for, which is just around dealing with culture and history, particularly here with sort of echoes of colonialism and various other things. But there's also sort of family drama hidden kind of within all of it as well. So I think these two potentially could be the ones from Tilted Axis. I think a few of the other books they've released that would be eligible, I think, are, in terms of timelines, are, for example, one of them was a poetry collection, one of them was a collection of essays. So those would be ineligible. So I believe that these are only two novels released within that time. But I could well be wrong, and almost hoping that I'm wrong, so that there's another Tilted Axis book in the mix as well. I also think a press like Three Times Rebel could also well find its way in there. I really loved reading The Carnivorous Plant last year, one of my favourite books of last year, and I think that this book by Andrea Mayo was just such a fascinating way of looking at of relationships and domestic violence and assault and various other things, which are all quite heavy topics. But the other two books that they published last year, I believe, would also fall into the time frame of being eligible. So Deadlands by Núria Bendicho, and also Mother's Stone by Aticha Guerre. And I think all of them could be really fantastic shouts for the prize. I think maybe Deadlands might be the one that has a stronger chance, but I also think I'm rooting for The Carnivorous Plant here as well. I think is a fantastic, fantastic book. I'll also say that Charco Press has had a really good history of having books sort of in and around the shortlist or long list, or at least just highly favoured by a lot of readers in recent years. I don't know enough about their releases to really be able to make a judgment call here. Salt Crystals seems to be the one that a fair few people have really enjoyed, and indeed it's sort of the one of theirs that's highest on this list, I believe. And I should say that in terms of the being high on this list. This is voted by readers in terms of what they predict will be up there. So I think Salt Crystals by Christina Bendicho is maybe the one that seems to have sort of taken up a bit of, it seems to have gathered some love as well. I think within that as well, Peirene Press have had a couple of books out this year, that are in the eligibility period, including a few others as well, actually, History and Mess being one of them. Bori Kintsugi seems to be well loved. I'm really keen to eventually read all of these. I realise I'm talking through quite a lot of these books quite quickly. If you want more information on what actually the books are about, rather than me reading every single blurb, they will all be in this list that I'm talking about. Equally, Of Saints and Miracles by Manuel Astor is in there as well in terms of being eligible. All fairly short as well, which is also quite interesting. I'm hoping so far from what I've seen that actually it looks like a lot of the long list may be full of fairly short books. That's nothing against long books necessarily. It's just that I think last year looking at the shortlist made me want to cry a little bit because suddenly there are a few chunkers on there. Tomb of Sand, which I think was incredible and very, very glad won. It was a beautiful, beautiful book. And also it wasn't actually as long as it seemed because there are quite a few sort of line breaks or page breaks or whatever in that book. Books of Jacob was also long listed, which was long. That was a good 800, 900 pages, and quite dense and quite a big book as well, which I struggled with a bit, but I think, lots of people really loved. I just didn't happen to be somebody who really got it. But that can add a bit of stress because there's a really tight turnaround between the long list and the short list, and then from there to the winner. And so I think having a fair few big chunky books on there can really disincentivize you from wanting to check them all out, even if in and of themselves, if you had proper time for them all, those would be really lovely to sit and read as well. And with that, we'll go on to talking about a few other potential hopefuls, I think. So one book I'm certain as much as you can ever be certain in these things. One book I think has a very strong chance of being in there is Time Shelter by Georgi Gospodinov, which I'm reading currently. I'm sort of about 50 pages in, and don't judge me for my bookmark just being the little tab that came from the library when I got it out. It's one of those books that I think also prizes tend to shower quite a lot of love on, and I think here for very good reason. I'm really enjoying it from the bits I've read so far, but it deals a lot with essentially sort of almost time traveling kind of figure who's sort of a constant throughout bits of history, and in doing so deals a lot with European history, and seems to be dealing so far with a lot of ideas about how we understand history and who we go to for information around history. So it could be potentially very, very interesting. And I think has a decent chance. I think is probably one of the ones I'm most sure on so far. I could be entirely wrong, but who knows? A few other books that I have here with me that are eligible, but that I think I think have a decent chance, and this list seems to agree because people have also bumped them up quite high. One of which is Nona Fernández with Space Invaders. She has another book that's eligible on this as well. This is also very, very short. It's like a good 80 pages. This book seems to it seems to have a kind of a fair few people voting for it. I don't know if that's just because more people have read it to be able to vote for it as a potential option, or whether it's just one of those ones that people have a really strong feeling about, but there we go. We also have The Queens of Sarmiento Park by Camila Sosa Villada, and this seems to be I just picked this up on a bit of a whim when I was in Gaze the Word in London, and I had no idea how recent it was or anything like that, but it's a book that seems to deal a lot with essentially a lot with sex work, a lot with people kind of on the street, people, it's sort of it's a lot that seems to deal with, it's described as a queer fairy tale about sex work, and it deals a lot with a range of trans characters, or at least how we would describe them as trans, and seems like it could be quite an interesting one. I was quite surprised to see that this was eligible, because for some reason I'd not even really thought about it. But yeah, there we go. As is Kevin Chen's Ghost Town, which is a book that talks a lot about well, it's a story of a man who moves to Berlin to sort of reconcile and be sort of have a bit of a sort of understanding around his sexuality as a gay man. So there's that. There's also Hannah Orstavik's Ti Amo. She is an author that seems to be really well loved, and I have never quite delved into yet. But this very small, again, but a very short book, again, seems to be one that a fair few people have spoken about lovingly. Whether the fact, because it seems to talk a bit, her writing seems to straddle the line often, it seems, of non-fiction and fiction, and so whether this also fits into that is a thing in and of itself, but could well be up there. So let's see. Okay, so with all of those having been said, I realise I've said a lot of names of books. Please, if it's easier, please just look at the longer list and click through on Goodreads, and I think that's going to be the easier way of checking out more of them. I was just very aware that me reading out the plots or mentioning everything about all of these authors would be incredibly time consuming, and that's already it's already potentially going to be quite a long one. So my list that I've chosen, which is almost definitely entirely wrong, is as follows. So Time Shelter by Georgi Gospodinov, which I think has a really strong chance of being there. It seems like kind of book prize fodder, and that's why I think it's kind of there. Our Share of Night by Mariana Enriquez, I think, has a really strong chance of being there. I think it's the kind of gripping, long book as well that deals a lot with politics and human things in a very, very interesting way. I also think I sort of mentioned Space Invaders by Nona Fernández, just because it seems like there are lots of people who have been really hyping this book up and really enjoying it. So that's that one. Chinatown by Tuan, which I think again has a really interesting way of approaching writing from what I've seen so far, and it seems like it deals a lot with a type of story that's not always told, in terms of an experience of a Vietnamese family kind of dealing a lot with travel and migration and various other things. I realise the 4 I've said so far are the first 4 on this Goodreads list, so well done, Bob, super original. The next one I have is So Distant From My Life by Monique Elboudou, because I think the way that this deals with the sort of story and sort of history of this sort of fictionalized place, although written by an author from Burkina Faso, is also quite an interesting fresh take, one that we don't seem to have too often. I then think on the Fitzcarraldo front, Stillborn by Guadalupe Natel. I just think this seems like a gripping, interesting kind of book that deals a lot with the inner lives of characters in quite fascinating ways. Staying on the Fitzcarraldo train, I am going to also say Jon Fosse's Melancholy 1 and 2. Everybody loves a Jon Fosse, particularly in book prizes, and I think this seems like the kind of book that also does tend to do well on rereading, so I think if it's longlisted it will also maybe make the shortlist, and I think could have a decent shout. I also think Ti Amo by Hannah Orstavik could be a really interesting book for this list. Just again, the International Booker, I think, is a lot freer with how it seems to approach books that straddle that line between fiction and non-fiction, and then indeed they have short stories on the list that the other Booker doesn't have, so I think it could be really, really interesting for that too. On short stories, 7 Empty Houses by Samantha Schweblin, I think also has a really good chance of being there. I think from reading it, it was a book that I think I found really interesting. I think could be really fun to have on a list like this as well, just as to mix it up a bit in terms of having some short stories, particularly short stories that deal so interestingly with different types of story around little family dramas, but often with a bit of a twist, often with something a bit kind of tricksy and a bit kind of messed up at times in them as well. Also, I think Greek Lessons by Han Kang could be a really interesting book. I think, obviously, as a former winner, we know that she's going to be submitted. And I think this book itself sounds really interesting, and I'd really just like to read it anyway. So hopefully it will make the list anyway. But there we go. Then I think a couple of others that these are slightly more my wild cards, but ones that I think could be really fun on the list because they are a bit wilder. So the first being The Last One by Fatima Daas. I read this a little bit ago, and it's also on the Republic of Consciousness long list. It's a book of a French-Algerian woman who talks a lot about her relationship with both parts of that identity, and particularly within France itself as this sort of mother country, and the kind of complicated things within her identity. So particularly the kind of her reconciling being queer and reconciling that sexuality with religion, with gender, with expectations, both in France and Algeria, with all these other things. And there's a really confident writing style in this. It's written sort of as a this real like repetitive nature, this sort of circular thing of everything is her sort of writing this sort of almost diary style thing. But all the repetition really builds to something quite interesting, I think, as well. I also think Threadripper by this is now entirely where I forget who the writer was, by Amelie Smith. There we go. Thank you, Control F, saving people's lives for years. Amelie Smith with Threadripper, and this book is quite interesting for how it plays with the page. It's sort of split in two, where you will have, you'll have a few pages that are written in one way to do with a very specific thing. This is sort of, I feel like I'm being really cagey on the details here. I've not read it yet, but from my understanding of it, it talks, it kind of goes between this sort of story about weaving and kind of the sort of handiwork sort of style thing, and this other story going on, but these two parts are almost meant to be read side by side constantly, so you're meant to be constantly juggling these two bits as you go through the book. And there's also a decision basically you have to make on how you are going to read this book, a little bit about whether you read all of one type of thing first and then read the other thing, or just not. So yeah, there's that. And then last but not least, I also think Deadlands by Núria Bendicho. As much as I love, where have I put it? As much as I love The Carnivorous Plant by Andrea Mayo, I kind of think Deadlands has a little bit more of an appeal for a prize like this potentially. Again, obviously I don't know what's been submitted, so it might not be. Either way, I'd love to see 3 Times Rebel make the list for one of their books. I think they only started last year. Their first 3 books came out last year, and it'd be really great for an emerging press like that to just be given a little bit of love from such a big platform as the International Booker Prize. So with my almost entirely wrong list and my no drag knowledge, that is my list. I would really love to hear books that you think have a good shout as well. I'd really love to see what does make the list finally and see how wrong I am. But let's see. The spin of the wheel of the booker is always an interesting thing. And regardless, I think we'll be given 13 books that are going to be quite varied, will really hopefully stretch our understanding of the types of books that are already out there. And also it'll just be fun, I think, to read these. So let's go with that. Let's hope that is what it ends up being. And I'm looking forward to reading the long list this year. I think typically in the past I've just read the short list, and I'm excited to try and read the long list this year. Also probably why I'm hoping that so many of them are shorter books this year, but we'll see. I've been Bod the Booker. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.